So here we are looking at a tweet from Congressperson Ilhan Omar. If you're not aware of her, she's one of the young women who became a congressperson back in 2000, I think it was 16. And I believe it was 16, yeah, maybe 18, I don't remember, but as part of the so-called squad. And if you don't know what that is, you need to look it up, but it's Ilhan Omar, another gal named something Talib. I can't remember her last name or first name. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and then some other gal who nobody ever hears of her. But in any event, I want you to read this because looking at this PowerPoint, looking at this slide, looking at this tweet, here's what she said. She said, "We must put an end to this economic crisis with direct monthly payments to every family, expanded unemployment benefits, rent and mortgage cancellation, student debt cancellation, Medicare for all, including free COVID-19 treatment and vaccines." Now, that all sounds wonderful and would be great in some fantasy world. And I'm going to be blunt with you here. This is a person in Congress who has absolutely no understanding of economics, or if she just doesn't care. Okay, these kinds of things simply cannot be created out of thin air, and people who think like this, quite candidly, either they're lying to themselves or they're lying to the people they represent, one of the two. And of course, they're lying to themselves and they're lying to the people they represent. So they're, I know I'm being very blunt here and being very straightforward with you, but this is absurd. Okay, there's just no other way to say it. You just can't keep giving away money, keep giving away money, keep giving away money. You can't do it because eventually the well runs dry. We don't have unlimited resources to just keep pumping money into the economy by government fiat. That's not how this works. And for her to suggest this is reckless and irresponsible at the minimum. And I mean, it's just a stunning lack of any sort of sense of reality or any sort of sense of economics. So what you might guess is that we're going to talk about economic policy here for a bit for the rest of our time today. All right. First, I want to look at this chart, and this shows you what's called the year-over-year changes in the U.S. national debt. In other words, this isn't the actual amount of the debt. This is how much it went up or down, always up, you'll note, since the year 2000. So in the past, this goes to 2014. And you can see that between 2000 and 2007, a relatively, I'll say, steady, give or take. I mean, essentially, we added $500 billion to the debt every year between 2000 and 2007. So 3.5 billion, give or take, actually a little less, but we'll say 3 just to round it off. Then notice in 2008. Now, in 2008, we did have a significant economic downturn, and the money was pumped into the economy supposedly to get it going again. Maybe it helped, maybe it didn't. We'll look at another chart in a minute and see whether we think that's what really did it or whether it's just the economy rebounding on its own. In any event, the government poured, as you can see, and you look here in 2008, the government poured $1 trillion, and then almost 2 trillion, and then $1.5 trillion, and just over $1 trillion, just over $1 trillion. You know, this is debt that the United States has incurred. Now, you will hear sometimes people talk about the United States incurring this debt and treating it like, and saying things like, well, my family can't take on that debt, therefore the government can't take on the debt. Well, that's not exactly correct. This is not a good thing. Don't misunderstand me. I mean, these debts have to be paid at some point, obviously. And if the United States were to default on its debts, it would tank the entire world economy in a very, very significant way. Okay, understand that. It would be a disaster for the world economy. And you'll see why in a minute, in a couple of slides from now. But what does this mean? Well, this means that the United States has borrowed these amounts each of these years and borrowed it by selling treasury bonds, T-bills, and other instruments of debt to investors. One of the things you get by selling, if you're the government and you've sold these bonds and you have sold these treasury bills, one of the things the person buying them gets is they get what they believe is a very safe investment. B, they get a very clear return on their investment. And C, they don't have to pay taxes on the increase. So if I buy $100,000 in treasury bonds and I get a 3% return, which is $3,000 a year, that $3,000 a year isn't taxable, which means that I would have to, depending on my tax bracket, right, have to make depending on I have to make another 2,500, 2,000 a year to make up the difference if I'm in if I'm in a high enough tax bracket. And so it makes sense for me to make that investment. So that's why people do it. The United States remains the world's economic juggernaut and superpower. And as a consequence, we can continue to float out this kind of debt. Inevitably, one would think it's going to crash in on us, but thus far it has not. This is what I was talking about when I said that we need to look at the gross national product, okay? And here's what I'm talking about. This is the gross domestic product of the United States from, and you can see right here, 1990 to 2019. And remember, we saw the spending, the debt went up in these years, right, along in here. And I told you about half a billion a year. The debt went up. Now notice the general trend of the gross domestic product, right? And then we hit an economic downturn in 2008, and so it did drop down a bit, right? I mean, clearly it dropped down, but then we get back on track, and it doesn't appear, again, if we go back, if we go back, you'll notice in 2008 there's this giant influx in 2009 and 2010, but then when you start going along the trail here and you go 2009, 2010, well, really the increase looks to be at about the same rate as the increase always was. And so thus the question, obviously, it doesn't beg the question, by the way. That's a logical matter. It does, however, obviously suggest that we ask, well, in this time frame when we took on all this extra debt, did it really matter? Did it really make a difference in the economy? Given what we see all the way along here, where a lot less debt was incurred, and the same general trend, I mean, it's pretty much the same. It just doesn't look like it really mattered. So one wonders, did we really need to incur all that extra debt? Did it really make a difference? And the answer is not really. The gross domestic product was increasing and has increased at relatively the same rate over the long haul. So that would thus get me to say this is completely unnecessary. These giant increases in debt were not, if as claimed, they were intended to cause the economy to jumpstart, well, they didn't really serve their intended purpose, and so probably weren't worth, engaging in this kind of debt. But that's a political question that gets answered every couple of years and every 4 years and every 6 years when we elect our congresspeople, our president, and our senators. And so it would appear the people of the United States don't really care. That's what it boils down to. Maybe they should, but they don't. Another economic policy issue is the national debt as a percentage of gross domestic product. Now, let's go back. This is our gross domestic product from 90 to 2019. Okay, and it's in billions of dollars. So we're talking about, look at this, 20,000 billion, okay, $20 trillion here in 2018, and then 2019 we're almost at the 22 trillion mark. Okay, it's incredible how large the U.S. economy is. I said just a moment ago, and I'll say again, if the U.S. economy were to tank, if it were to blow up, if it were to fail in a big way, it would ruin the world economy in an enormous way. Okay, no one in the world can afford for the United States to fall economically. They just can't. That is a practical matter. Again, we'll see in a couple slides why that's the case. All right, so that's the GDP, right? Gross domestic product. This is the value of the gross value of all goods and services produced in the economy in any given time frame. And gross domestic product just means everything. That means food, that means books, it means keychains, it means wood, it means lawnmowers, it means cars, computers, you name it. It means it. Services like restaurants, services like gas stations, services like attorney services, teachers, everything. Okay, that's the value. And how do we get this? We do the best we can. Okay, so it's not concise and it's not precise. It's a general number that's based on a variety of economic indicators that economists use to come to a reasonable estimate. Okay. The national debt, and we just talked about taking on the debt, right? And you see this national debt as percentage of GDP. Now, I want to quickly go here because it was 120% in 1946, 47. Well, we had just come out of World War II, right? Here's World War II starting. Here's World War II ending. Okay, see that right here? World War II starting, World War II ending. And so you wouldn't be surprised to see us take on a lot of debt in order that we could build the things we need to build. Armies had to be funded, machine guns had to be made, ships had to be made, airplanes had to be made, submarines had to be made, helmets had to be made, food packages had to be created, the whole 9 yards. Okay, clothing had to be made. I mean, you name it. The military needed a lot of stuff in order to conduct the war, and particularly since we were conducting the war both in Europe and in the South Pacific and in part in Southeast Asia, I suppose. And so when you start, and we were just sending out hundreds and thousands of troops and all kinds of gear. You can see, interestingly enough, you can see here, now this is world, look down here, look to my left, I don't know, I suppose it's your right, but you can see where I've got the cursor circling there. I hope you see that anyway. Down near the bottom here, towards the 0, this is World War I. Now notice, we didn't play nearly as significant a role in World War I, and so of course, the debt the country incurred was not anywhere near as significant. We also didn't have the kind of economy, not quite like we have now. Now remember here, this is interesting, this dip is where the Great Depression occurs. Okay, so you see that gully there, that's where there's a depression. And you see the debt goes back up, which is an odd thing to do when you don't have money. And yet that's what the government decided to do, was to get into more debt. And again, the theory being, well, let's pump the economy up. My suspicion is that probably had about the same effect as the slide we saw a couple slides ago, where it probably made a modest difference, but maybe it helped some, I don't know. Well, of course, we get off this enormous amount of, and this is, as, by the way, this is as a percentage of gross domestic product. In other words, this measures the amount of debt at any given time as it correlates to the gross domestic product. In other words, how much of the gross domestic product would we have to spend if we wanted to just pay it off? And you can see at there at the height of World War II era borrowing, we couldn't have paid off the debt. We owed more than we were making. Now, of course, that drops off because we start paying off the debt. We start incurring less. There's a economic boom in the 1950s. So you see the debt going down, down, down into the 60s, even into the 70s, interestingly enough. In the late 70s, here we are in the late 70s, the economy was not roaring, but yet we made the borrowing went up just a hair. But notice we're down into the the 30s as far as percentage of gross domestic product. That's extremely, you can live with that. In other words, think about it this way. And again, we'll use the analogy of a home, of being a family. If a family owns a home and you're spending 30% of your gross income on on debt in terms of home ownership and any other debt, then that's probably livable. And most people, most financial experts would say, yeah, that's okay. You should be okay if you're down in that range. And so that's, if you want to look at it that way, that's where we are. Well, but then of course we get into the early 80s and it starts to climb again as a percentage of GDP. Now, part of the theory that, part of this is a buildup during the end of the Cold War. There's a military buildup by Ronald Reagan in an effort to force the Soviet Union to its knees. We'll have to let historians deal with whether they think that was what happened or not. But in any event, you get into about this time frame right here and the Soviet Union collapses. So maybe it was worth it. Again, I don't know. We see that the percentage has gone up of GDP. We're now hovering over 60% and then back down into near 60% here towards 2005, which is the latest numbers I could find. Here's the point. This is unsustainable. Everything under here is probably reasonably sustainable. This is a problem, okay? And again, it's a problem because it taxes your economy. This debt has to be paid. And government revenues have to take care of it. And you can't just keep, rechurning the borrowing. I mean, you can, but it never gets rid of it. That does drag the economy somewhat, because that means that one of the problems with having large debt owed by the government is that means the government is borrowing money that might be lent out to businesses, okay? But instead, people are giving their money to the government because they get a better rate or they get no taxes, and the difference between getting a higher rate of return and reducing my tax burden evens out. And so I just say, it's just as easy to, and the stability of government debt from the United States, people just decide, yeah, I'll just go ahead and borrow and, lend to the government rather than lend to a business which I don't know if it's going to work or not. That creates problems. That's why you'll hear, for instance, Kentucky Senator Rand Paul is on this kick constantly about the overall debt that we have as a country, because it does suck up available funds that people might otherwise invest in business that they don't. And so it's one of the reasons why you'll hear people so frustrated by it. Well, so here's our boy Skip. Skippy says, I keep hearing about gross domestic product. Sounds like something from a horror movie. And then Skippy laughs at his own joke. Okay, of course. That's Skipster for you there. Well, the gross domestic product is the total value of goods produced and services provided in a country during 1 year. Okay, that's what I said earlier. That's just a basic definition. World GDP, this is from 2015, so I apologize, this is a few years old, but you saw a few slides ago that the United States is actually really closer to 20, closing in on 22 trillion now. In 2015, we were at 18 trillion. Notice something really meaningful here, and this is meaningful. Our nearest competitor, China, is just over half of our economy. That's probably changed a little bit, but probably not a whole lot over the last 5 years. The gap is still there and is sizable. Notice that the United States economy is as large as the next 3 largest economies in the world. And by the way, when you combine those 4, right? I want you to think about this for a minute. You look at those 4. It's roughly 37, and we'll just round up to 30, let's say $37.5 trillion, okay? $1 trillion in economic goods and services, created by those. Well, when you start adding up the rest of these countries, and we'll quickly do this, we'll just round up, and I'm going to round quickly, so 3, round that to 3, 2.5, 2, I mean, golly, we're at 5, 7.5, 9.5, we'll even round this up to 2 and say 11.5, 13. Notice we haven't even gotten into the United States here. 14.5, we'll go to 16. We'll round this one down since we rounded those up. We'll go to 1, that's 17, 18, 19, 20. It takes number 4 down through number 16, the next 12 to just equal the United States alone. And it drops off precipitously as we go further down. And so you see the point. And to get to the top 3, it takes another 20 countries in much of the rest of the world. And so it's a stunning way to look at this. Thus my point a little while ago that the United States simply economically is the gorilla in the room, if you want to say it that way. And if the United States economy crashes, the rest of the world's economy is going to crash. That's a big problem for other countries, especially China, because China both wants to be the aggressor and take over as a leading economic power. But the problem with that is that China also has to be careful, because if you tank or ruin the United States economy, you're going to put yourself into danger as well. And this is why, because it is just so enormously large and it impacts all these other countries and it just towers above them. And again, you throw China out and you've got to add up the next 10 before you get to the United States. That's how big it is. And so it really does have an enormous ripple effect on the rest of the world. If the United States has a bad economic year, so does everybody else, as a general rule. Okay. All right. So I want to talk. So that's kind of some basic numbers. All right. Just what you see about stuff. Okay. GDP, debt, those kind of things. So now let's talk. And I started by showing you this tweet from Ilhan Omar, and suggest to you she's just out of her mind. Let's talk about economic theories, and we're talking about here what are called macroeconomic theories. And so this is going to be a very basic discussion about macroeconomics, okay? And I'm not going to, this isn't an economics class, and so I'm not going to get into deeply to it, but I do want to spend a few minutes going through this so that you understand some of the economics that we're talking about. First, I want to talk about what's called Keynesian economics. Now, here's John Maynard Keynes. He thought that the government ought to intervene in the economy in the short run so that the government could help tickle the economy or help the economy out. And notice what he said: by a continuing process of inflation, government can confiscate secretly and unobserved an important part of the wealth of their citizens. So he was not, despite what you might hear when you hear the word Keynesian economics and you then think, oh, massive government intervention in the economy, it's not really completely accurate. And Keynes clearly understood that, hey, if you can keep prices going up all the time, well, guess what happens? Property taxes just automatically go. You don't even have to raise the tax rate. Okay, if you keep inflating the value of things, the taxes that get collected increase without ever increasing the tax rate. Let me give you an example. And I'm just making this up. Let's say the property tax rate is 1% of the value of a home. And a home is valued, and I'm going to make the math easy for myself. The home is valued at $200,000. That would mean that the tax is $2,000. Okay, fair enough, easy. But let's say that inflation pushes the value up the next time that assessments occur. Let's say they occur every 2 years, whatever, it doesn't matter. And so 2 years from now, that house is now worth $220,000. Well, guess what? Okay, yeah, the tax goes up to $2,200. The tax rate stays the same, but the government collects more taxes. And that's what he's talking about here when he says by continuing process of inflation, the government can confiscate secretly and unobserved an important part of the wealth of their citizens. And now don't misunderstand that quote. I don't think he was recommending that. I think he was making the point. Keynes thought that once you stoked the economic fires, the government should then pull back out and let the economy do its thing. He was, for the most part, what we would refer to as a classic liberal economist. Liberal not in the current term politically, a liberal in the classic liberal economist sense. He was not as liberal as others who, that's where we get our idea of libertarianism. If you're familiar with libertarians, they think the economy should be left alone pretty much, and they're largely think that taxes should be minimized and that the government should intervene as little as possible in economic affairs, or in any affairs for that matter. And that would be the classic liberal economic approach, hands off, right? The government doesn't have any business being involved in the economy and should collect taxes as needed to, maintain the military and do some basic household chores around the country. Otherwise, stay out. Keynes was more willing to say, let's have the government insert itself here strategically, or tactically, maybe even a better way to put it, here and then here, but then pull back out and let it go. All right, so that's John Maynard Keynes, and he's very well known. Okay, I know you don't know him yet. Now you do. You know a little bit about him. Here's a second guy, and this guy was classic. Okay, classic liberal economist. Okay, classic in the purest sense of what it means. A society that puts equality before freedom will get neither. A society that puts freedom before equality gets a huge degree of both. Look what he says. I'm in favor of cutting taxes under any circumstances for any excuse for any reason, whenever it's possible. If you put the federal government in charge of the Sahara Desert in 5 years, it'd be a shortage of sand. He did not like government intervention. The greatest advances of civilization, whether in architecture, painting, science, literature, industry, agriculture, have never come from centralized government. As you can tell, he's not a big fan of the government being heavily involved in the economy. Obviously, Mr. Friedman and Ilhan Omar would have very serious disagreements about what to do economic policy-wise. I would suggest to you that despite the mantle which people would give to John Maynard Keynes, that he probably doesn't agree with her either, because she's talking about let's do this forever. And even Keynes would say, yeah, you can intervene, but you can't keep doing it. You got to stop eventually, because the government can't get stuff from nowhere. Let me make this point here while we're talking about Friedman, because he's your classic superstar. We would now refer to him as conservative, but that's not really the right way to refer to him. A classic liberal economist. Basically, no government involvement in the economy, or it's just absolutely as little as possible. Understand this, that when you tax something, when you tax it, you get less of that activity. If you tax an activity, less of it will occur in the long run. Okay, it may not in the short run, but over time, you'll get less and less of the activity if you tax it. Okay, and that's just what taxes do. Because it's economists sometimes refer to this as a friction cost. They'll sometimes, you may hear other terms used to talk about what taxes do, but they're a drag on production. They're a drag on the sale and purchase of goods and services. And so anytime you place a tax on something, people they don't necessarily, but they may buy less of it. This is particularly true when it comes to things that are not necessities. Now, this isn't anywhere in the PowerPoint, so you might want to take a note here, okay? Because I'm going to talk about something that isn't anywhere in these slides, but you're going to need to know this. There's a thing referred to in economics as elasticity of demand. Elasticity, E-L-A-S, elasticity, T-I-C-I-T-Y. So T-I-City, T-I-City. Okay, there you go. What does this mean? Elasticity of demand refers to how much ability a person has to decide whether or not to purchase something, regardless of price. What does this mean? Well, for instance, food is highly inelastic. That is, people will buy food even if the price goes up because you have to have food or you die. People will budget more money for food when food prices go up because they have to have food. So that that's a very, what we would refer to as inelastic demand. Okay, the same is true somewhat, not completely, for say medical services. There's something of an inelasticity of demand for medical services. In other words, if you need to go to the emergency room because your leg or your arm, I mean, is like hanging and dangling, and it's because it's broken, your demand is relatively inelastic. You don't care what it costs, you want to get your arm fixed. Does that make sense? Hopefully that makes sense to you. Friedman would have understood that and would have said, well, that's why you want government out of things, because the more freedom economic actors have to engage with each other, the lower it will keep prices of all things, including those which have a more inelastic demand than others. People, and the things that have the more elastic demand, so things like leisure activities, okay? What's going to happen if you start having economic hard times? What are people going to stop doing? They don't go to the movies as much. Well, that's not exactly true, but that's a phenomenon we can talk about maybe someday. But people do engage in fewer. They do go to the movies less. They do stop purchasing, going out to eat as much. They stop going to events as much, events that cost money. So operas, playhouses, sporting events, they tend to take a dip if economic times get really tough because people just can't afford to go. People stop, they look for things to do that don't cost them as much. So they go to the park, or they go to the beach, they go to the lake, where they can hang out without it necessarily costing them or costing them very little. Or they buy a board game that they can play over and over instead of just going and bowling, when they roll and they're done. And so you can see how that might shake out. Those things are elastic, and that is that people react to those kinds of items by purchasing less because they don't have to have them. So the supply is what we refer to as more elastic. Okay. And Friedman would say, well, but that's how you balance things out. The things that are inelastic, guess what? They get balanced out by the things that are elastic, and people can move their resources around in order to deal with those kinds of issues if you're not constantly sucking away all their money through taxes. Well, here's one of the most glib economists, and he was known for his glib statements, John Kenneth Galbraith. Galbraith, unlike either Keynes or Friedman, and Galbraith was more contemporary of Friedman than Keynes. He was kind of in between the two of them, but closer to Friedman. Galbraith says the modern conservative is engaged in one of man's oldest exercises in moral philosophy. That is the search for a superior moral justification for selfishness. Now he's referring here to the idea of Adam Smith, who wrote in 1776, about the invisible hand, which he referred to as greed. Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations. He was a Scotsman who wrote this book, and in this book he proposed, in basic terms, what we now refer to as sort of raw capitalism. Galbraith is pushing back on that in a big way, obviously. He also said under capitalism, man exploits man. Under communism, it's just the opposite. Again, the glibness, it's funny, ha ha ha. But here's the thing. He was not a defender of the free market. He believed the government in government price controls. He felt the government should maintain a major role in economic policy. Galbraith won. Okay, by and large, in Western civilization, Galbraith has won the day. Keynes lost. Keynes' sort of mediating position lost. Friedman's no, stay out. Friedman's position lost. Galbraith's position is the one that has prevailed. And it ought not to surprise you when you start thinking of how government gets involved in things, and then once it gets involved, it seems as if the government never relinquishes its authority or power over an area of our lives. So, Galbraith's theory, he won the day. And although I wouldn't call him a communist because he didn't believe, obviously, he doesn't think that communism is the right route. He would have considered himself to be, I suppose, a socialist of some sort. And I'm putting words in his mouth, so forgive me, but this is where we are. And this is where we've been for a long time, by the way. It's not as if just the last 10 years, suddenly the United States took some hard turn towards the government having a major role in economic policy. It's been going on for 50, 60 years, so it's not new. All right, we're going to go back. We're going to come back to the Laffer curve. That's what this is. I'll talk about that in a few minutes when we finish up here. We got a couple more slides and we're almost done. Very basic economic theory here, okay? This is Econ 101. In any given market, for any given good, all right, you have what is referred to the market clearing price and the market clearing quantity. Price, over here you see price, you see the dollar sign, right, on the vertical axis, and then on the horizontal axis you see the word output, often also quantity, Q, and you'll see economists use Q here and P here. And it's very simple. Guess what? As price goes up, suppliers want to supply more of the product, whatever it is. We'll call it a widget. And that's classic. The economists use the term widget because I guess there's no such thing as a widget, or maybe there is now, but there never used to be. And so they used widget as sort of this generic product that was being done, what was being made in order to talk about it. So we have, as the price of widgets goes up, suppliers of widgets, makers of widgets, and people in the supply chain selling widgets want to produce more widgets, right, as the price goes up, because for producers, price going up is a good thing, right? But notice over here, right, so this is what we call the supply curve. And it's a curve for reasons that don't matter. It could be a straight line for our purposes. It can be a straight line. Okay, it doesn't have to be a curve, but we'll refer to it as the supply curve. Over here's the demand curve. Well, guess what? Consumers, you and me, if we're consuming widgets, the higher the price, the less widgets we buy. That's just the way it is. Now, let me tell you a little story about this. Okay, in years gone by, flat screen TVs were insanely expensive. And I'm talking about, 15, 20 years ago, okay? You could buy by today's standards, a crummy flat screen TV would cost you $3,000. And they were still pretty large. I mean, they had a lot of stuff going on. They were not the thin little things you see today. I mean, you could buy, look, every time I walk into Sam's Club, of course, they put the TVs right there, and I'm a guy, and, I walk by, and I'm kind of going, wow, I can just imagine myself watching a football game on one of those TVs. And you can get a very large television now, a 65-inch screen for $700 or $800, and a very good one, a very nice one. You don't have to, you can spend $2,000 or $3,000. I saw one that was like $5,000. It was giant. It would have taken up the whole wall in my basement. Excuse me. So you can get them, but the fact is that the price of those things and the quality has gone, the price has gone down, down, down. So consumers have bought more and more and more and continue to buy more and more of these things because the price keeps just coming down, 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 down. Same with personal computers. I remember buying some years ago, probably 20 years ago, spending about $2,500 on by today's standards, your cell phone has a lot more computing power than that computer had, and it probably cost us $2,500. Now it was for the whole package. It had the computer and the keyboard, and we did buy some speakers and some other miscellaneous things, but some of the programs. But I mean, it's ridiculous compared to today's prices. The laptop I'm working on right now probably cost me $400, and it has 50 times the computing, maybe 100 times the computing power of that $2,500 computer. So as price goes down, consumers want more, right? That only makes sense. So buyers want more as the price goes down. Now, look, this assumes all other factors are equal, quality remains constant, and so forth. Okay, and then if it doesn't, it can create problems with the demand curve, as we call it, right? So you have the supply curve here in red and the demand curve in blue. Well, what happens in any given market, theoretically anyway, is that eventually you get what is called the market clearing price, right here, where they meet, and the market clearing quantity, or output, as this calls it. Either one is okay. Whoops, sorry about that. And this is basic Econ 101. This is how a basic market works for any given market. Now we're now talking about what we refer to as microeconomics. We're talking about specific markets for specific goods. This isn't the market for all goods across the country. Again, remember inelasticity. Here's what happens when, and perhaps I should have messed around some more with these, but when you have an inelastic product, the price doesn't really matter much. And so at any given price, the demand is kind of basically straight up and down. Okay. In other words, the price doesn't impact the demand at all. The demand is fairly steady. And so the output remains fairly steady. So this is your basic market, and this is what's called the market clearing price. And in getting to that market clearing price, what it means is that all purchasers who really wanted to buy the product and all sellers who were ready, willing, and able to sell are satisfied at that place. Would sellers like to be up here? Yeah, but they know they can't. Would buyers love to be down here? Yeah, but they know they can't. The buyers who want to be down here aren't buying. The sellers who want to sell up here can't sell up there. So they have to make decisions. And eventually what occurs is that you get to a point. Now, fascinating reality here. And this is one of these things. And again, this isn't on any of my charts or anything, so you got to write this down because you could easily see this on a quiz. One of the fascinating topics that we hear a lot about in the news and even from government people like Ms. Omar is minimum wage. Oh, we need minimum wage, minimum wage, minimum wage, minimum wage, right? Because, oh, people are not getting paid enough, blah, 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 okay? And you probably heard the arguments and maybe you agree with them. Well, let me suggest to you that an interesting little reality, the minimum wage right now, I think, is still $7.50 an hour. Nobody makes that. I say nobody. Hardly anyone makes the minimum wage anymore. If you go around Louisville, entry-level jobs at McDonald's or Chick-fil-A or working as a cashier at the Kroger or working as cashier is pretty much of an entry-level job anywhere you go, right? And so if you're working as a cashier, nobody pays $7.50 an hour anymore. Cashiers get paid $10, $11, $12 an hour. Some get paid even more, okay? The market corrects for those things ultimately. Now, the problem people have with markets is they don't react instantaneously oftentimes. It takes some time for them to react, and nobody wants to wait. But the reality is that nobody makes minimum wage anymore. Again, I say nobody. Very, 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 very few people are making minimum wage because if I'm paying, here's the problem. The demand, and here here's what's interesting. The suppliers, right, are employees are suppliers, right? People who want to work. Potential workers are the suppliers, okay? Well, guess what? Suppliers at this price down here, you're not going to get very many suppliers of employment services. They're going to stay out of the market. You see the output here. At this price down here, you get very few people actually providing employment services to employers because they're just not going to, because it's not worth it. But as the price of employment wages, as the price of wages goes up, and this is very general, It doesn't work all the time. It's not absolutely correct in all circumstances, but as a general proposition, here's what you see. Okay, as wages go up, guess what? More and more people enter the marketplace. And guess what? The demand increases as, again, the demand, now at this price, the demand is way out here. Employers will hire way more people than are willing to work. This creates an interesting problem for us. If you have a minimum wage, and I'm not against, but don't misunderstand, I'm not against a minimum wage at some level, but it needs to be down here. It needs to be, because a minimum wage creates a price floor. And here's the problem. If you don't know what the market clearing price is for sure in a particular industry, and you set a minimum wage too high, here's the interesting thing. Here's what let's say you set it up here. Let's say this is $11. And let's say in Louisville, Kentucky, the market clearing price for entry-level jobs is $11 an hour. I'm just saying that, making it up. But here's what happens. If you move the minimum wage to $15, employers, the people who demand, notice what's going to happen. People who demand employment, people who are demanding employees, the quantity, right, the output of demand for employees is going to drop because the price is higher than the market clearing price. Oh yeah, more people will want to work, but fewer employers will want to employ them. So here's the problem. If you set the minimum wage above the market clearing price, you're going to create a gap between who employers are willing to employ and sellers of employment, right? Sellers of work, employees. It's going to be a gap. You're going to have potentially less employment. And I hear all the time, oh no, you get more employment with minimum wage. That defies all basic economic principles. Okay, it just defies it. So understand that as a general matter, again, I'm not saying this is true all the time. Now, if you know the market clearing price is $15 and you want to set the minimum wage at $15, well, go ahead, because you're going to get what you were going to get anyway. Or if you want to set it at $12 because you know the market clearing price is $15, well, then set it down here so that you know that there's some bottom level that you say, look, you can't go below this. We're not going to let you do that because we know the market clearing price is a little higher. We're going to let you drop down just below it, but not a bunch. We're not going to let you pay people $5 an hour because it's just not reasonable given the market. Hopefully that helps you understand the idea of minimum wage and why. The difficulty is figuring out where you're setting it. And are you setting it above this market clearing price, or are you setting it below? There's no point in setting it at the market clearing price. That makes no sense. Who cares? So if you set the minimum wage at $11 and people are getting paid $11, well, then what's the difference? You've not really done anything. What happens when there are changes, okay, because in markets, well, sometimes what you will see are something like this, right? You'll see a situation where, for whatever reason, the entire supply curve shifts. And what's occurring, okay, as you can see, is that the market clearing price in this instance is going down because suppliers are producing more of something. More than likely what that means is that their cost of supplying that item has also gone down, right? And so they are able to supply more at a lower price. And that's good for everybody, right? Because now people who demand that product can actually pay less. Look, here's what they would have paid before, and here's what they're paying now. Again, I just used the example of flat screen TVs. This is what's happened in that market. As the product has gotten better and more accessible and easier to build and more sophisticated, and at the same time, the supply curve has shifted. And frankly, probably the demand curve has probably shifted as well. In other words, people are willing to pay the same price because they're still willing to pay $700 because they're getting so much more. I have a flat screen TV I bought in 2010. I remember that because the World Cup, there was a World Cup in 2010, and my son Zachary loved soccer and loved playing soccer, and he was, I don't know, 12 years old at the time, I think, or yeah, something like that. And so he had a bunch of friends over, and we all watched the game between Spain and Holland, or Netherlands, I guess I should say, that year. And about half the kids were rooting for Netherlands, and about half the kids were rooting for Spain, and they had a good old time. And it was a brand new TV, and I still have it. Well, but it's about this thick. And now, you get these little suckers that are an inch thick. Anyway, just an example of what happens when cost of production change, or that could even mean wages have gone down for some reason, or the cost of goods has gone down, or some new manner of making the product has made it less expensive to make, or the supplier simply can create more of it at the same cost, which would again change the supply curve. Those things happen sometimes. All right, last thing. I know this has been kind of long. Last thing. Let's talk about taxes for a minute. This is something put together by a guy named Arthur Laffer, L-A-F-F-E-R, and what he referred to as the Laffer curve. I'm showing you this because there is some logic to this, although, he was, forgive me for saying, he was laughed at by some people for putting this together. But basically what Dr. Laffer suggested, he was an economist of some renown, by the way. He's not just some guy. It's not Gus Nelson just making this up and putting it out there. This is a real economist with real credentials. And he said, look, let's think about what happens with taxes. And what he argued was, he said, look, what you want, if you want to maximize tax revenue, okay, you want to get it up here. See where P is? That's what he called maximum. That's the maximum tax revenue, P. Okay, it's down here is zero tax revenue, and look, you get Q is again, remember quantity and price, right? This is kind of what we're getting at, right? What he was suggesting is, he said, look, if you can find a rate of taxation, the best possible rate, and who knows what that might be. And what he said was, that look, you will collect more, because if your tax rate is too low, obviously you don't collect as much. And let's just think about this for a minute. If your tax rate is 1%, you collect $1 for every $100 of whatever it is you're taxing, right? Whether it be costs of something like a sales tax, or whether it's income tax. Well, that maybe that's not enough, and if you want to get to this volume up here of tax revenue, which he's got up here on the y-axis, right? He says, look, this is tax revenue. Well, the most tax revenue is P. Well, then you want to try to find this rate here, which he called the normal range of taxes. And again, I'm not going to give you the entire analysis here, so I'm just trying to give you the basics. But basically what he said is, look, there does come, and the truth is, this has been shown to happen, okay, in reality. For instance, particularly with capital gains taxes, when capital gains taxes reach a certain point, people who have wealth, who can afford to basically invest in businesses, okay? So for instance, you buy stocks. Let's say you buy a stock and you buy 100 shares of a stock for $1,000, $10 a share. So you buy $1,000 worth of the stock. And in 5 years, that stock has increased in value 100-fold. So you've made a huge amount of money, right? You now have $100,000. And let's say the tax rate is 10%, right? The capital gains rate is 10%. Well, you have to pay, when you cash in, you pay $10,000 less your $1,000 investment, right? Because that doesn't count against you. So you pay $9,000 in taxes here, okay? Well, we don't know where that is exactly, but what we can figure out over time is when that rate gets to a certain point, people start investing elsewhere, okay? And the key is, how do you get to figuring out exactly what this point is? Now that's the real key, isn't it? But the point is that there does come a point where, guess what? You can start taxing too much. Forgive me, I'm sorry. And when you start taxing too much, you start the revenue starts dropping again because people move their investments elsewhere. And what has been shown is that when the capital gains rate starts to go up, people put their money into other investments. And they stop investing, for instance, in the stock market. They don't invest in companies that have stock. They don't buy stock. They don't invest in other areas where they would have capital gains. For instance, they're not going to you're not going to buy a piece of real estate and then develop it and sell it because the capital gains tax will affect you. People are going to look for income instead of capital gains if the capital gains tax gets too high. And so you've got to figure out where that number is. Traditionally, it's been at around 15%. After that, people start to bail out of capital gains environment and move their money into income. Because what's the difference? And plus, you can shield income with costs. And that gets very complicated. So here's the point, and to distill this. So what you look, and again, I'm going to print all these, so you'll have these posted. But the main thing I want you to get out of this last thing here is that at some point you can tax too much, and at some point you can tax too little, really, depending on what you're looking for in terms of the tax. And it's the magical thing is, well, how do you find this? Well, it's a good, trial and error, basically. But at some point you do kind of start to get an idea of where you reach your maximum potential for any kind of a tax. Remember, I told you earlier that when you tax something, you get less of it. The more you tax it, the less you're going to get of it. If you tax buying luxury goods at an exorbitant rate, guess what happens? Suppose selling widescreen TV, QED, whatever these new TVs are called, whatever they're called. Suppose that the tax on it was doubled. In other words, if you bought one for $700, you had to pay $700 in taxes. Guess what? People aren't going to buy those. I mean, some people will. But a lot of people are going to go, yeah, no thanks. I'm not going to spend that kind of money on a television. I'm not going to pay the government $700 for the privilege of buying a $700 TV. I'm not going to do it. That would drastically reduce the output of those TVs, which then tells you something about what the government can do when it manages tax policy. If you want to get rid of something, tax it. Tax it a lot. Tax it excessively, and guess what? People will they'll stop buying it, or they'll stop producing it. And so that's one way to get rid of something, is if you want to overtax it. All right. So let me stop sharing here, and let's just get back to just this. All right. So that's everything I'm going to talk about it in terms of economic policy. So you be ready to think about that for a quiz. I'll post everything. But you'll need to know those other things I talked about, elasticity, for instance. You'll need to know about that. You'll need to know about liberal economists, what that means in the old days, because it's not anywhere in this stuff. So you need to know those things. So I hope you wrote them down.